Innocent until proven guilty is the backbone of our legal system, and yet we don't actually operate that way anymore. People now are brought to trial and assumed guilty until absolute proof of innocence is given. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. My guest today is James Porfido, Esquire. James was a prominent prosecutor with decades of experience serving the state of New Jersey to defend its citizens. Then, everything revealed its ugly nature to an extent that could no longer be ignored. James became a criminal defense attorney and worked to represent those who found themselves wrongly accused and without proper representation. While you would think that both sides are working for the greater good, James was ultimately abandoned by many and chastised by more. Join us as he explains the true inequality of the justice system and what you can do to prevent yourself from being another wrongfully convicted statistic. Let's ask for our lawyers before talking to anyone. Welcome to the show, James Porfido.
Thank you so much, Colton. Thank you for having me on. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy and excited to talk about my book and my experiences.
Yeah, I am so excited to have you. I've been looking forward to this all week. Why don't you introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Sure. I'm an attorney with over 35 years of experience. I'm a certified criminal trial attorney, certified by the Supreme Court of New Jersey since 1995. I'm a former prosecutor, head of sex crimes and child abuse and vehicular homicide. And then I kind of went to the dark side, as they say. I became a defense attorney, and I've been a defense attorney for more than 25 years. And on top of that, I've been on commentary, TV legal analyst for a lot of high-profile cases that everybody would recognize that were in the national media. And also I'm a law professor at Seton Hall University School of Law, where I teach a class, Persuasion and Advocacy. So I'm really excited to be here and share my experiences over that 35-year career, and really a lot of the things that happened through that career representing both the state and the defense in some pretty high-profile cases.
Yeah, well, and talk about wearing a lot of hats, author, defense, prosecution, TV personality. Like, where did this all start?
Well, I think what I say is the book kind of wrote itself. The people in the books are really each case is a story about an individual or individuals, and it really led me in the direction of writing the book. And some of the experiences I had were representing crime victims throughout the years as well, from my prosecution days and then carrying over into the defense world. And those were really unique and really tragic situations involving, for instance, that one particular case I represented a crime victim, a homicide victim, the mom whose son was murdered, and I was helping her to get funeral expenses for her son through the state of New Jersey. I also was involved in a case involving a vehicular homicide where a brother and sister were killed by a drunk driver, and the mom and the dad were seeking justice, and we were able to shed a light, get a spotlight on the case and the stalling of the investigation, and through some media publicity and write-ups in one of our state papers. It was a big expose about how this killer was not being brought to justice, and ultimately he was, and was pled guilty and was sentenced to 10 years, 5 years for each death. But I stayed in touch with the mom and dad who started the foundation in memory of their children. And then, it just kind of gathered steam, I'll say. In a different kind of a way, and not something I ever really expected or wanted. I then represented a family whose daughter came to Seton Hall University to play basketball in South Orange, New Jersey, and she had gone to a frat party and was murdered. She was shot by a gang member initiating with the gang, and I sat by them in the courtroom and tried to explain to them what the criminal justice system was all about, and tried to explain what was happening through each step of the proceedings. So, I had some very unique experiences and some tragic cases that I dealt with as a victim's rights advocate. and also as a prosecutor. And I was always sensitized to that. Even as a defense attorney, I was sensitive to, the victims in the case, as difficult as that might be to believe. Certainly, I was sympathetic to that and their plight and looked at that situation. But I certainly had a job to do, which was representing my client and making sure their constitutional rights were protected.
Well, and it's a very important job. It has to be done in our system, or, things could just get really out of hand really fast. If it was just the court of public opinion, like,
Yeah.
things would get really bad.
Yeah, we see that happen quite a bit in cases where, they get tried in the media and people don't really know the facts of the case. They don't really know the evidence of the case. And ultimately, that's what it comes down to, is the evidence in the case. And the state always has that burden of proof of the government beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's something that I saw later on in my career was not being honored and respected, particularly for my clients. And, it was like a call to action to get involved and to vehemently, aggressively represent people with a passion to make sure that when they went to court, they were truly innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around. Simply walking into the courtroom being accused of a crime doesn't make you guilty of it.
Well, and there's no doubt students all across the country and the world, pursuing this right now. How important is it to like get into a very good school, like one of those high end, named like Harvard or something like that?
I don't know that I place value on the actual law school that you go to. And I honestly, law school is really about teaching you to be analytical, to be able to see both sides of the equation, to see both sides and be able to change direction. And that, I'll tell you, that experience did allow me to go from being a prosecutor for a number of years to becoming a defense attorney, because I think in some ways I wore the same hat. I continued to be a prosecutor, but I evaluated the case being a defense attorney as if I were the prosecutor. I said, well, what evidence does the prosecution need? And is this evidence admissible? Has everything been done correctly? Did the police follow the requisite standards that we would expect under the Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination, the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures? And certainly I valued and respected, and probably most of all was the Sixth Amendment. Not that I gave them any priority or order of significance, but the Sixth Amendment is your right to counsel and your right to confront the witnesses against you. And, it says the right to counsel, but I kind of viewed it a little bit differently. I said good, competent, capable counsel, not just counsel. You don't want just somebody standing next to you. You want somebody that's, passionate about your defense and believes in your defense. And I think that is important, and it really is something that's not emphasized enough.
Certainly. Well, and being along that analytical mindset and, looking at those things, what do you think are the most important skills that, up and coming attorneys can have?
Well, you know what? It's easy to become jaded, I think. That's the difficulty. And I think if you went from the law school experience into the work world now, I tell my students this, there is many different hats. There are different lawyers out there. Not everybody's a litigator. Not everybody's a criminal defense attorney. There are personal injury lawyers. There are medical malpractice lawyers. There's estate planning attorneys. There's tax attorneys, so it runs the gamut. Real estate attorneys. I can think of so many different. So I say the class we teach is persuasion and advocacy. And I say it's really not about being inside a courtroom, even though it is the anatomy of a trial. For instance, an opening statement, direct examination of witnesses, cross-examination of witnesses, introduction of exhibits into evidence, and ultimately a good, effective closing argument or summation. But, you don't need to be in a courtroom. Persuasion and advocacy is really what life is about, because not everybody's going to agree with our point of view on things. So it is about having a conversation, having the ability to be conversant with someone and speak to them and say, you know what, I don't necessarily agree with the way you feel on this, but let me tell you how I feel, and please tell me how you feel. And, I would never say someone's opinion doesn't matter. Right. It's really important to listen to people and hear what they have to say. We may not all agree. And I say that about that class because you can apply the skills of persuasion and advocacy just in life, because you're going to deal with people through, all different walks of life. in different types of venues or situations. So you have to be able to, navigate those, let's say.
Well, and sometimes it is just that personability. Like I had a divorce attorney. We never went to court, never saw the inside of a courtroom ever. But his opinion to just say like, look, I know what you're saying, and here's the reason it won't matter. I value that you feel very strongly about this thing, but in the legal sense, what you're saying isn't going to affect anything. And that's
Well,
sometimes like a very powerful ability.
I get that. I get that because I can't tell you how many people over the years who were accused of crime say, I just want my day in court. I just want to. And I'd say, you know what? It may not go the way you think it's going to go, and it could go terribly sideways or upside down, and it could change your life. So, my job was to navigate through those choppy waters at times where things were a little bit difficult and to say, look, the evidence here is this. This evidence may or may not be admissible. We need to explore that. That may be something we want to bring to the judge. But ultimately, if you have 12 people in a jury box, they're going to be determining your fate on a criminal case, and they have to be unanimous. And, you're really rolling the dice. It really is about rolling the dice. And I think that the job of a good attorney in any venue, family law, criminal law, is to say, look, let me just dispel this idea that you have, because people watch a lot of television and they get these ideas that, hey, this is the way the system works. The system doesn't always work like that. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news and tell people that, but from my experience, if I don't share that with you, then I'm not being very good as an attorney.
Right. Well, and that kind of brings up like the other skill set that is needed and probably no one is ever taught, which are the skills you need to be a good juror.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, number one skill is listen, listen. And, I've heard from jurors after cases are over, and it's difficult. That I value and respect jurors. I may not always agree with their outcome or their verdict, but how they got there is what's the most important. And they have to sit and listen to a trial, and are not supposed to be discussing their potential verdict in the case before the case is over, and they get everything, including the charges, which the judge ultimately reads the charges to the jury at the end of the summations. And that's the relevant law. People come in and we like to think of them as a blank slate, but unfortunately, we're really not. We can't walk into a courtroom and just leave our life experience outside the door. That's not possible. So people do have biases or interests, and somebody might be predisposed to believe, hey, somebody's guilty, and I'm just going to stay in the jury box, and I'm going to see that happens. Well, that's not, in my opinion, a very good juror, because they've already had a predetermined outcome in their mind. And that's really not what I would want in a juror, and nor would the court want that, because the whole idea, bottom line, fundamentally, is that you want this to be a fair process. You want it to be impartial, the judge to be fair, impartial, detached, and neutral. That means if there's any biases or interests, conflicts of interest, they need to be disclosed, so that if that judge, similar to a juror, has an interest in the outcome of the case, they have to tell you that up front. And unfortunately, we've seen too many situations where judges stay in cases where they should not be. And that, quite frankly, casts a shadow on the whole system when something like that happens. It really calls into question the integrity of the entirety of the system.
Well, and it's one of those that I've never quite understood. And I think it's because I wanted to go to law school. Fresh out of high school, I was like, oh, this would be great. And I just kind of fell into emergency medicine in such an immediate success that I never really had to consider it any further. But like being a juror seems like such an amazing responsibility that I don't understand people who are like, I will do anything to get out of this.
Yeah, well, you know what? It is. It's a tremendous responsibility. You think about it in a serious criminal case where somebody's facing significant time and they've got to sit in judgment. Not everybody wants to do that. Not everybody wants to say, hey, I find this person guilty. But that's our civic duty. Quite frankly, we only have a couple civic duties. One is that we vote, and the other is that we have the opportunity to be jurors. I often reminded jurors of that when I was a prosecutor, certainly as a defense attorney, that your responsibility is an awesome responsibility, and take it seriously. It is serious, but that is a tremendous responsibility to be a juror, for sure.
Yeah, it's just one of those that I'm like, well, imagine if you were on trial for anything. Would you want a bunch of jurors who are proud to be there and looking forward to doing their job, or a bunch of people who don't want to be there? Like, well, choose to be the right one.
Right. And that is a big thing, quite frankly. You brought up a lot of interesting topics just through that. One is that as a prosecutor, I always believed the jury wanted to believe me because they were paying my salary, and the situation of the courtroom, and I've said this before, is the way that the courtroom is situated. The prosecutor is closest to the jury box. And in terms of order, the way things go in the case, it kind of leans to the state's favor. And I think if you do a good job and you're able to be convincing and have the ability to communicate with people, they want so much, very very much, to believe you as the representative of the state, that you're doing a job, and they want to be proud that you're there in that position, and they can say, hey, this prosecutor did a good job. And the difficulty is to go to the defense side, become a defense attorney, and now all those favors, or those, I don't want to say favors, but that those advantages you had as a prosecutor no longer exist as a defense attorney. And I also felt in my defense years later on in my career, that judges were predisposed to want to believe the prosecutor. It was a very unfair fight many times. It was almost 2 against 1 because the courts wanted to side with the prosecutor, dispelling the notion that somebody is guilty until proven innocent. That happened far too often. If you walked in with a client, or the client was in custody and standing next to you in a jumpsuit with being brought over from the jail, well, there's automatically this mindset that this person must be guilty. And, you had to dispel that notion really quickly. And it was difficult to do, if not impossible to do in some cases.
Well, and that's kind of where a lot of high profile cases that we've seen in the past, like Casey Anthony or the Menendez brothers, they dress them up in a very specific way to try and,
Yeah.
change that perception to be like, okay, they're not walking in looking like someone from jail.
Well, there's a fine line between theater and courtroom, and I always said, if I hadn't been an attorney and wanted to be an attorney like you at the end of high school, and pursuing that through college and law school, and I kind of talk about that in my book, the whole experience of how I got into law school, and it was a bit of a challenging experience, I probably would have been an actor, because I felt it was like almost the same skill set, almost like the same skills to be a good actor are very similar in a lot of ways to being a good attorney, and being able to look at people that you don't even know and have a conversation with them and be comfortable with that conversation, looking them in the eyes and saying, you know what, believe what I have to say because I have no reason to lie to you. And there is a power of persuasion in that. There is the ability, and I believe some attorneys clearly have and other attorneys don't. It is a skill. I think it's a developed, acquired skill, and might be natural to some extent. I mean, you might have the natural ability to be able to communicate with people and speak to them.
Well, and in some ways, you kind of did achieve that actor's goal, as I assume you have like an IMDb page for
No,
appearing on TV shows.
no, I've only done TV. And you talked about Casey Anthony, you talked about the Menendez, but those are 2 cases that I actually did commentary on. O.J. Simpson, Michael Jackson, Robert Blake, Phil Spector, Harvey Weinstein. These were cases, Scott Peterson, that got national publicity and were in the news, almost daily. The news has changed a bit, since those days where, it's a lot more computer generated, internet based, where people get their information through podcasts or news sources, using their computer, not turning on the television so much. And those cases got national attention, and I had the ability to talk about those cases and give my experience, and be called as an expert commentary, it was interesting, and it was definitely an exciting part of the job. I'll say it lent itself to, I don't know, I want to say credibility, maybe some additional credibility.
And, we always look at those public cases, and I think people have a very hard opinion, that they stand on, where it's like if you talk about, especially with, podcasts becoming so popular and true crime and all the documentaries, like people stand very hard on one side of like the Menendez brothers or Casey Anthony or Scott
Yeah.
Peterson. Is there any of those that you've seen that you're like, this one was definitely a huge miss? Like the outcome was wrong and unfortunate.
Well, it's hard to say that because that's me being an armchair quarterback. It's really hard to sit back and put yourself in the place of the jurors. If you didn't evaluate and hear all the evidence, see how the attorneys, not that I value this way up on it, but it certainly is a factor to be considered, is how did the attorneys perform in the courtroom? How were the judges' rulings? Did the judge seem like they were leaning one way or the other way in the case? And I certainly have experienced that. So, without knowing everything, I'm reluctant to say that they got it wrong or they got it right. We all know about OJ for sure. Everybody over the years has, and there's been so many documentaries, so many stories, and you just turn on Netflix today and you can find a new OJ show. And, we know about that case and the overwhelming evidence that was presented. We know about the background of the case, the dream team, the prosecution, Darden and Clark, and, and the glove not fitting. And if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, Johnny Cochran's famous line. So we all know something about that case. And also the change of venue to move it from Brentwood, California to Los Angeles. And whether or not that was a factor in the outcome of the case. And that was on the heels of the Rodney King case, where there was a racially motivated police action against someone. And, so all these things factored in. So, look, do I think that the jury got it right in that case? I don't think so. From what I have heard and seen over the years, and certainly OJ's own words, I think he kind of convicted himself over the years. And my heart certainly still goes out to the Goldman family and Nicole Brown Simpson, who was murdered, the two murder victims in that case. So do I think justice was done? I don't think so. I really don't. But I guess justice came around later on for OJ when he stole his memorabilia and then he got sentenced to 12 years in state prison. So, I don't know the answer to that. It's hard. And justice has so many different definitions for different people. Like I often said, if it's a homicide case, there's no such thing as justice on this earth. You're not going to bring back a loved one.
Well, and it's one of those that like we are gifted now with perspective, right? It's been decades since the OJ trial. So
Sure.
we have a lot more information and things we've seen that we're like, well, that was a huge mistake, like scrubbing down crime scenes, because it's an HOA thing or, whatever else. I think it's a lot of those that were like, wow, that's crazy. And I know I had just recently heard one from Casey Anthony's defense attorney that had said, like, I'm really glad that prosecution didn't bring this thing up because I had no defense for it. So they were
Mm.
like, even after the fact, they're like, well, now that I can talk about this, I'm glad they didn't say it.
Yeah, that happens a lot. I mean, what evidence is too much? How much is enough? And if you have a case where you have a lot of evidence, sometimes you've got to weed through it and say, okay, this has the most powerful impact. I've had cases like that where, a lot of witnesses observe, and one in particular I'm thinking about is a prosecution of a vehicular homicide where the driver was more than 2 times the legal limit. It was kind of a milestone case in our county, in our venue in Morris County, New Jersey. The driver was clearly intoxicated, and there were many people that were calling about his driving conduct because he was going through red lights, traveling on the knee and on the shoulder. And it was really just a question of where and when he was going to impact with someone and ultimately kill them. And that's what he did to this young mom who had her 3 children in the car. So in that case, there were so many people that had observed his driving conduct before the impact. And it certainly lent to the recklessness that was involved. And the case was a very interesting case, and it really stood for a lot of principles and set a lot of precedent in New Jersey because the husband came involved after I explained the law to him that was traditional at the time. The death by auto laws carried a maximum of 270 days county jail or 270 days community service. And when I explained it to him, he said, the outcome is the same if it's a gun, a knife. It shouldn't be, an opportunity for the judge to downgrade this to something. So we went forward on an aggravated manslaughter, which the indictment was returned by the grand jurors for aggravated manslaughter, which is the equivalent of a murder without a purposeful knowing intent. And ultimately, to all those witnesses that testified, he was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in state prison, 10 years without parole. And, that was kind of my commitment to her husband, that I would do everything in my power to prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law. And I did that. The husband himself became involved in a mission to change the laws in the state of New Jersey, and he did. He petitioned over 100,000 citizens throughout the state and was able to get the laws, which we now have in New Jersey, carrying mandatory state prison. If you drive drunk or recklessly and kill someone, you now face a mandatory minimum sentence of 3 years state prison. And that was as a result of his efforts. And it got this story kind of evolved because he started a foundation to speak to high school students about the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol awareness, being a driver or passenger. And about a year after the case had concluded, he himself was jogging and was hit by a car and killed. So I left the prosecutor's office at that time, and I took his place on the speaker's board. He was really the sole speaker. And I spoke to about 75,000 high school students over 2 years, taking his role and speaking about the dangers of drinking and driving and drugs and alcohol awareness, and talking about the case involving his wife.
Well, and especially for something to serve, as a deterrent, right? It can help to prevent crime, to say like, hey, this is not some slap on the wrist sentence where you're going to get 9, 8 months, whatever it is.
Right.
Like, you're going to at least do 3 years. Like, it has at least a little more staying power. Was there like a specific case, if it was that one or another, that caused you to swap sides to where you're
Well,
like,
that was the case, actually, that particular case, because when he was killed, I literally put in my resignation within a matter of days, because the foundation he had created really probably would not have been able to advance or go forward without his presence. So I took his place on the speakers, doing the speaking. He was the face and the name of the foundation. And then we did a very, very high impact multimedia presentation to high schools, because it was hard to get to them. High school students, they know everything, and you're trying to hit them on so many different levels with an awareness and the understanding of what the law means, which many of the cases that didn't mean anything to them.
yeah.
They talking about a mom with her 3 children in the car was a foreign concept to them. Even drinking and driving was something that they couldn't, really get their head around. So the company we had contracted with, or Bill had contracted with before his passing, was this motivational media company. And I think that was the name of the company, actually, Motivational Media. I don't know if they're still around, but they did these very big, high scale productions in a gymnasium or auditorium with these 3 big screens, and it was all current. So every year they would update it. Music, sports figures, actors, actresses, talking about experiences, and it really was impactful.
I had the good fortune to be able to be part of these presentations to a couple of high schools when I was in the fire service, where we brought in like wrecked cars, and we put a tarp over them. We brought everybody out to the track, and then like uncovered them, and we did it like it was a mock accident, and then the next, we do that like on Monday or Tuesday. And for the rest of the week, those students were out of school because they were, presumed dead, kind of to play it up. And I think I saw that really hit students a lot harder, where they're having an emotional impact, to something that they know was staged, and yet it still has, a real effect.
It's funny you say that. Not funny, but I was just involved in a program every 15 minutes, it's called. And they just put it onto YouTube with the high school. The Madison police put the program on with the Madison court and Madison high school. So they did exactly that, but much more like each stage of the proceed. Like there's an accident or a crash. You never say accident, crash, because it's preventable and predictable when you put alcohol and you drive. So I would be careful not to say that as a prosecutor prosecuting those cases. But in these cases, or that case, there's 2 students that are killed, and then they go through the whole process of the medical intervention, And ultimately the court proceedings, that's where I came in, and the funeral. So it's really carried out over real life. It's almost like real life, and it impacts the students tremendously. And they ultimately put it on YouTube, and I think they just released it last week. But I was a part of that, and I have to say it's a really impactful program. It does a tremendous job. I commend the police officers and everybody that's involved with the program. They really do an awesome job. The first responders that are volunteering their time and their efforts.
Yeah, it's an amazing program, and I hope a lot more people get to see it, now that they did a full production and it has, a YouTube presence, it's on the internet. I hope more people get to see it. When you're taking on some of these cases, as you said, you went to the dark side, quote unquote, to work for the defense. Do people see you as a bad guy on both sides, or is it mostly when you're the defense?
Well, that's a great question because, yeah, like I'm the same person, but all of a sudden I switch sides, and so all the police officers and law enforcement friends that I had, some of them stayed with me, some of them didn't, but it was always a challenge and interesting to cross-examine a police officer involved with an investigation. But I think ultimately they had a great deal of respect for me as a person and understood where I was coming from, that I was doing a job. And, people would often say that. I mean, that very thing is, how you represent people that are, guilty of these terrible things. And I would remind them and say, nobody's guilty unless and until they either plead guilty or they're found guilty. We all have rights that we need to be, protected. And, if you were in trouble or your child were in trouble or your family member in trouble, you would want someone like me that believes very much that the system has to work the way it's supposed to work. And it doesn't always. I'll confess to you that it doesn't always. There's prosecutorial misconduct. There are judges that make bad decisions that can impact a case. And, but we work the best we can with those parameters. But I would tell people that. I would say, we all get our day in court and we're all entitled to the protections of the law. That's what our system provides.
Yeah, we are all human, and the human element is flawed, right? And so
It is.
any portion of this can have a flaw in it. I can just see both sides, like when you're a prosecutor, the person on trial has a family that's there that's like, I can't believe this prosecutor is being such a jerk and going so hard on them. And then when you're on the defense, there might be a victim's family that's like, I can't believe he's trying to get them off for this. And
Right.
you're like, I can't win. I'm always the bad guy.
Well, you know what? You're right. You're right. But that's part of the job, I think. As a prosecutor, you look at the crime and the evidence. You don't look at the person. I try not to evaluate the person because you can't personalize it. If you start personalizing each case, then it becomes almost impossible to do your job. Now, as a defense attorney, quite the opposite. I did everything in my power to personalize my client, make the prosecutor understand who these people are, what they're all about, maybe that they have a family or that they're supporting and that they made a terrible mistake or, they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. These things happen. And so as a defense attorney was very different. It became very, very much about the individual. And certainly you're right. I mean, if you're a defense attorney and there's a victim's family involved, like a sex crime, and it's a younger person, and you're representing the accused in the case, they may look at you like you're the devil, for crying out loud, like, hey, how can this guy do this? But ultimately, you have to, it's the integrity of the system. And that's the way the system works. I didn't design the system. I didn't make the system, but I'm operating within the rules of law that we have.
Well, I think a lot of people, until they're forced into a situation where they're in a courtroom observing things for the first time, like they can only operate on what we see in TV and movies. And there are, quite a number of flaws. For as many of them, like, probably do really good jobs, there are probably as many that do a really horrible job.
Yeah, and it's so true. When you go into a courtroom and you're in that setting, you have to remember that, like, at least from the juror's perspective, and probably most, the clients for sure, they've never set foot in a courtroom. And I always looked at my job as an attorney as I have to educate. I'm not just an attorney here. I am explaining to you, and if I'm not explaining it and you're not understanding it, then I need to explain it better. But you need to understand what you're facing, what the realities of the situation is, the process, leading up to a trial, the pretrial proceedings. Why do you have to go to court so many times before you actually get the opportunity to pick a jury if you're maintaining your innocence? Explaining that each step of the way. And I think that's the role of a good attorney, is to be, an educator, explain that. And if you're not, then maybe you failed in some sense. And I always say to a client is, you got to be comfortable with me. We've got to be able to have a conversation. And if you're not comfortable telling me everything and anything, then I might not be the person to represent you.
Well, and it's also one of those, I think TV kind of gives us this perspective that, like, an extremely high profile lawyer is working on one case and one case only over the course of, 3 years or something. And that's in no way the truth. You're usually juggling cases, right? From
Right. Right.
dozens to, I assume, more.
Right. And then the other thing is, what you point out is that it's like they see TV and they expect it like high impact. They expect to be entertained. What is the evidence? Is it like some technical evidence where you're going to bring in some forensic scientist, or, a fingerprint expert or a ballistic expert, so, they're anticipating, this like expert testimony and all these graphics. Maybe you've got diagrams, maybe you got a little movie to watch or something. And they might be really misled by that and really believe that they're there to be entertained. And I try to tell them that right away. This is not going to be one of those situations that you see on TV. And don't expect this case to get wrapped up in like a half an hour or an hour. It's not going to happen. It's not going to be like that. There's going to be a lot of delays. And, don't blame me or even blame the prosecutor or the judge. That's just our system. It's working itself out. And then sometimes things take a while. And I can honestly say that I experienced that as a defense attorney many times, waiting to get to trial. It took a long time to get your case to trial.
Well, and is there a lot of difficulty, in handling so many things? How do you retain all the information to be like, all right, this was very specifically from that case. It doesn't have any crossover to this one. I got to remember what I've told this person. Like, how do you handle all those multiple responsibilities?
Well, you got to wear a lot of hats for sure. And I always looked at, when I had my own practice. Now I closed my practice in 2023, but you had to wear a lot of hats. Like you have to be the rainmaker. You got to bring in clients, which means you have to advertise or get the word out. You got to pay rent to a landlord if you're renting space. You've got employees. You got to pay their salaries, and you got to run a successful business. You got to make it profitable, or you're not going to be in the business very long. So you do have to be able to compartmentalize. And part of that is thinking about each case and evaluating each case and being able to keep them clear and separate, and I think at some point you just kind of inherently do that. You say, okay, this case, I've got to pay attention to this. These are the issues. I'm going to focus on these issues. But when I put that case down, I got to pick up this case, and it's a completely different case, different facts, different evidence, different charges. And you got to be able to kind of, I'll say, pivot from one to the other.
Well, and I think the one that we always hear is like chronically overwhelmed, and this may be very true, is public defenders, where they say like they are handling just tons of cases at any given
Right.
time.
Yeah. And I say about public defenders, as I say about attorneys, as I say about prosecutors, as I say about judges, there are good and there are bad, and people have this conception, well, a free lawyer is not a good lawyer. And I'd say, no, that's not necessarily true. These attorneys work very hard. They've got a volume of cases. Some of them have a better reputation than others. Yes. Some of them are more inclined to go to a trial than others. And I will say that some of my hardest fought cases as a prosecutor were against public defenders, and one particular public defender used to give me a run for the money all the time. But I tried a lot of cases against public defenders, and they were good lawyers, skilled lawyers, and they had the benefit of getting that experience.
Well, and it's one of those that like that's a necessary service. It's part of the Miranda rights when you're read, into any arrest, right? Guilty or not, that should be one of those things is just ask for your lawyer. You get one just based on your rights.
Yeah, yeah, and I believe me, that is a very important right, constitutional right. And I can't tell you how many situations when people would call me and say, "Hey, look, I got a knock on the door. The police want me to come down and give an interview and give a statement to them about this." And I'd say, probably not a good idea. You should be invoking your right to an attorney, and it might be the time to get an attorney, because I don't think you're going to do yourself any favors if you go down there and give a statement. You might not be leaving police headquarters. They might know a lot more than you think they know. And, you might be not just a person of interest, but they're looking right at you as the accused, and they're looking to nail you down for this crime. Now, that experience, I can tell you over the years, like when I said this to a client, "Look, I'll tell you what, why don't you give me the detective's name? I'll be happy to call them and leave them a message." And probably 6 out of 10 of them will never call me back. They'll just back off. But there'll be those 4 that will actually call me and say, "Well, why are they getting an attorney if they're innocent? Why do they care? Why don't they just come on down and talk to me?" And I'd say, well, there is something called the Fifth Amendment, and it does protect them against self-incrimination. And they also have a right to counsel under the Sixth Amendment. So we're going to invoke our right. And I'd say, "Officer, I've represented enough police officers over the years, and you would be the first one to come forward and say, I don't wish to make any statement." I said, so it goes both ways.
Well, and I think it's one of those that, again, like it leans on the TV and movie experience we've seen where, guilty or innocent, like when you get on into the interrogation room with officers or you get on the stand, like if you're right, you're just going to come out on top. When the reality is like you're going to get grilled pretty relentlessly because they're looking for anything they can get, either to fight the case or to make a case.
Correct. And that's for sure. And they might be coming at it from a totally different angle that you never even expected. And I looked at it in many situations, and I talk about it in the book a little bit about these, what they're called consensual overhears, because typically you would need to have a warrant to overhear a conversation if you were a police officer, or to do an investigation and conduct an investigation over the phone to get somebody to make incriminating type statements. And so they, by and large, particularly in sex cases, they use these consensuals where they would have the victim contact the accused and say, "Look, I just need you to apologize to me and say you're sorry for what you did." And they might say, "Well, I'm really sorry, but I always looked at it as, well, sorry that's not enough. Sorry for what? You can be sorry that you feel that way. Maybe you feel really terrible, but that doesn't mean sorry means you committed a crime." And oftentimes that became an issue in the case. That just that simple word, sorry. Well, sorry doesn't mean anything. But the problem is, let's say in a situation like that, "Hey, I need you to acknowledge the fact that you were with me Friday night. We went to the movies together." "Oh, well, yeah, of course we did." "No big deal. Why not?" "Yeah, and you were alone with me, and you were fooling around with me, and oh yeah. Well, didn't you, I said to stop and you continued to do it." "Oh, no, I don't remember it that way." "Well, wait a minute. Now they've just established something really incriminating evidence. You were alone. You had the opportunity. You have acknowledged that. So you know this person. You were alone with that person. And clearly you were engaged in some kind of maybe conduct that led to the next level. So if they can cross the bases on 3 of that of the 4, that might be enough, and that's scary stuff."
Yeah. Well, and it is one of those, like, you are guaranteed to be in over your head, right? Like you went to school for a very, like we said, specific kind of law. Like tax lawyer and criminal lawyer don't have the same skill sets or knowledge base or, experience in all these things. So if you're a lay person, you don't have any legal experience, like you shouldn't think you can handle this on your own.
Well, we all get our experiences really after law school, because I don't think law school, at least when I went to law school, let's say, I don't know about today. I know it's very different because I teach a class, persuasion advocacy, which I never would have dreamed that there would be such a class, like the anatomy of a trial, how to dissect a trial and go from beginning to end, all the different things or components of a trial. But law school, really, you learn about your particular interest in the law when you get out of law school. Like you might intern with a tax attorney, or you might intern at a public defender's office or a prosecutor's office. And then you might do a clerkship with a judge, which I did, and get, firsthand experience in a courtroom about the proceedings and the rules of law, rules of court. So yeah, I agree with you. You don't necessarily, and most people are relatively unsophisticated, and they get into a room with a skilled investigator who has the ability to, interrogate someone, interview someone, and get them to acknowledge some pretty incriminating evidence. That's going to be pretty powerful against you. Once you waive your constitutional rights and you say, yeah, I'm willing to make this statement. Sure, I got nothing to hide. And so many people think they're so much smarter. And they say, yeah, well, I got nothing to hide. Why not? I'll tell you whatever you want to know.
Well, and I had seen a report, and I don't know if this is at all accurate, so I'm speaking out of hand here, but I had seen one that had said there are probably 2 to 3, roughly, convicted, but it was a wrongful conviction.
Oh, my goodness. Yes.
So there's
Yeah.
like 2 to 3 a day. And I'm like, whoa, that's not good.
Well, it doesn't speak well to our system. And, I did read a book. I did a master class with a guy, Jack Canfield, who wrote the book Chicken Soup for the Soul. He's one of the co-authors with Patty Aubrey. And he recommended a book that I should read. And I didn't think much of it, but he said, you should get this book framed. And I did take him up on it. And I got the book. It was written by John Grisham and I believe Jim Calhoun. And I've talked about this book a few times. And it's 10 actual real cases of people that were wrongfully charged, arrested, convicted, and sentenced. And it tells you how the system can be so incredibly bad at times. Prosecutorial misconduct where they use jailhouse snitches that they knew were lying, and they still advanced the prosecution of the case. And ultimately, they had evidence to support the fact that this individual did not commit the crime, and they didn't disclose it to the defense. Or the judge was having conversations with the prosecutor without the defense attorney, ex parte conversations, which is not allowed, and was becoming partisan to the state and making rulings favorable to the prosecution. And there were real cases. There were 10 cases of people that were actually wrongfully convicted and sentenced to a very long period of time. And one guy actually was put to death. And I saw the movie on Netflix. I just happened to be flipping Trial by Fire. It was done in 2018 about one of the cases that's in the book, about a guy that was accused and ultimately was convicted and sentenced for, imagine this, killing his 3 children, burning them in a house to death. And they used an arson investigator who had literally no experience whatsoever, who always gave an opinion that it was an act of arson. And he was completely wrong, absolutely wrong. He took a 48-hour course and testified as an expert witness for the prosecution, and ultimately led this to conviction. And the guy was sentenced to death and actually was put to death.
Wow.
And clearly was innocent. Clearly was innocent. They show it. They dispel that in the movie, but clearly in the chapter devoted to that in the book, it's gut wrenching that this individual went through this and ultimately put to death, which is the ultimate price.
Yeah. I mean, that especially, like, that's an extreme, but I can't imagine, how it feels to be that person on trial, and with 100% certainty, like, I had no involvement in this. What is happening? Like
Right.
at every turn, you're just like, why is this not, like, why is the truth not coming out? Why are all these lies being used against me?
Right. And that demonstrates that the system is flawed. It's not working, because, most people trust the system. They believe, hey, if I go to trial, the truth is going to come out. I didn't do it. There's no evidence to support me being involved in this. And they get proven wrong, really wrong, in so many ways. And, I thought reading that book was very, very powerful. I mean, as a prosecutor, I believed one thing, and is that, I was doing the right thing, and I felt with a clear conscience I could do my job. And I always believed that the people that were charged that I was prosecuting were the right people, and that there was evidence to support the charge. And I talk about it a little bit, and I say, I'd have to say, look, if I were a taxpayer, is this a prosecution that I would support? Is this something that I think is meritorious, that this prosecutor is going forward and advancing this case? And I think that that's really something that any prosecutor should be asking is, are the taxpayers in support of this prosecution? Do they think it's the right thing to do? And do they think that the evidence there is there beyond a reasonable doubt to go forward? And if it's not, then maybe you need to think back and maybe change your viewpoint on the case.
Well, and that's like you said, somebody who has valid morals and is looking at things objectively versus somebody who's like, I just want to win. Like, I
Yeah,
can't imagine having the weight on you of like, this man lost 3 children and I got him convicted and he was sentenced to death and I was wrong.
yeah. Well, how do you live with that?
Yeah.
How do you live with that? Well, the movie was very powerful. I got to tell you, it was a very powerful story. Can't think of the actress's name who played his advocate towards the end, but he had exhausted all of his appeals. He went through the process, really doing all the right things, working within the system to undo what was done. And at the end of the movie, Governor Perry, who was the governor of Texas, I believe he was running for president. I don't know what year it was. I want to say it was 2008, maybe. But he was on the platform with the other challengers, and a question was posed to him about the death penalty. And he said that every time somebody gets sentenced to death, that they have the ability to challenge their convictions. And he said he could sleep at night. And I thought, wow, then you really don't know that the system can be broken sometimes. And that's really what the subject of my book is. Unequal Justice is about the system, the breakdown of the system, and the search to find the truth. And sometimes it's evasive. The truth is not so easy, and the Lady Justice, peeking out from the blindfold means that it's really not fair, that there's a predisposition, and maybe put your finger on the scale and weigh it one way and give someone else an unfair advantage over the other, one side versus the other. And it tends to be the prosecution because, public sentiment is, well, let's put the bad guys away. We'll be living in a better world if we do that.
Well, and that kind of speaks to the last part of this cycle, right? Like we start with the offense, we go to trial, we do all these things. They end up in prison. Is prison really serving us the way it's supposed to? I mean, from your opinion, because we do seem to have like a very high recidivism rate, people that commit crimes even after they've been to jail.
Well, it's a scary place, and I think it's meant to be scary. I have visited clients in the prison system, and it's not a pretty sight, and it's certainly not designed to be a good experience for someone. But I think that there's so many things that go on in prison which are life changing, and rehabilitating people to come out and be good citizens is not really. I don't think it's necessarily a function of the prison system. I think it's just to segregate them from society and take them out of society at large and say, what, you did something wrong and this is your punishment. Now you have to live under these rules. And then of course there's the rules, and then there's the rules in the prison system. And actually that book, that story that I watched talks about the inequities and the problems in the prison system. We all see that, certainly have heard it and seen it on TV, and it's not. I don't think people are going there to get better. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it certainly seems like, I mean, it is a punishment, right? It's supposed to be, achieving justice for something. And again, keeping dangerous people away from people. I just wonder, like, how do we help? How do we make this any better than it is currently? Because again, it can't be a good experience. You don't want it to be like a great time in prison, because then
Right,
people are definitely going to do it again. Because
right,
like,
right.
yeah, it was really fun last time, so I'm going to go back.
Yeah, I don't think there's too many people saying that. Quite frankly, I don't think that that's. I think that it's just that their mindset may be such that they don't know anything else. It's easy to go out and how many people are in our prisons today that committed drug offenses, and maybe they were addicts, or maybe they were selling to support their habits. Who knows? But, maybe those are people that shouldn't be in prison and need to be fixed. Maybe we can help them in some other way. I'm not a bleeding heart. I don't like, I don't say everybody, but everybody gets a second chance. That's the way it is. I mean, really, and unless you do something really terrible, and then it's, there really isn't much looking back. But by and large, I think people deserve a second chance and they can actually respond to that. And you look at the juvenile system, the point of the juvenile system is rehabilitative versus the adult system, which is punitive or punishment. So there is an understanding that, at certain ages, things, you're beyond. Well, who's to say? I mean, it's such an arbitrary number. 18 is the number, right? You become an adult at 18. Well, who's to say that the 18-year-old that committed the crime, if he were 17, might have been treated very differently? But the law doesn't recognize that. The law says, no, you don't get that benefit, to be rehabilitated. You don't have the benefit of the programs or the resources that we have in the juvenile programs or process.
Well, and that brings up, juvenile court systems. Are the trials like they're the same kind of trial and what happens after is different, or are they very different from start to finish?
Very different, because it's a bench trial versus a jury trial. So you only have a judge presiding over the case, not a jury. That's one of the big differences. And of course, the major difference is that rehabilitation versus punitive. So, the point of the juvenile system is that you give individuals, as long as they haven't committed the worst imaginable crimes, the opportunity to reform and to become better citizens by adulthood. There is also a process that's called waiver, where if you commit something that's a very terrible offense as a juvenile, you can be waived to adult court. You can be treated as an adult, even though you're a juvenile, if you've committed certain offenses. And there is something called a waiver hearing, where the court would take jurisdiction over a case where there's a demonstration. The prosecutor has to show that the resources that are available in the juvenile system really don't benefit this individual, and they really should be punished versus being rehabilitated.
Well, and I have to imagine there's also like a timeline in here somewhere where, like, if you get 2 years as a sentenced juvenile, but you're 17, like, do you stay in juvenile until you're 19, or do you at 18 get moved over to like a
Yeah,
jail?
yeah, eventually. Yeah, they don't hold you in a juvenile facility.
Because that's interesting, because I'm like, it starts rehabilitation and then you hit that, the magic number of 18, and they're like, all right, off to jail with you. I know you might have been getting some form of help from this, but now you just got to hoof it.
Well, the sentence is the sentence. If it was initially as a juvenile, you were in a juvenile detention facility, and then you turn 18, I think the law requires that you have to then be transferred over to an adult jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's just one of those, like, we don't think about those in the public eye. And I think public eye has really started to swing, the last 20, 30 years. I think we were very focused on like individual offenders. We wanted to see those huge high profile cases that made news. And now we've started to see it swing kind of into just a political theater.
Well, yeah. I mean, and not to get too political, but there has been a politicalization of the system. Where you're going after people for their positions and whether or not they've actually committed crimes or offenses or civil acts, tortious conduct in the civil litigation arena. And I don't want to get too political, but certainly it has become highly politically charged. Even the cases that are going before the courts and who appointed those judges, and whether it was a political process and whether they should have recused themselves or stepped down from the case and transferred it to another judge, or the idea of forum shopping, like bringing a case to a particular court. Like if it's in DC, in the District Court of DC, we know that that's going to be a little bit more liberal minded, or New York, versus, if it's out in, let's say Oklahoma or Montana or Florida, where it might be a bit more conservative, and they wouldn't stand a chance of having those rulings, and whether the rulings are appropriate and are subject to an appeal, of course, to the Supreme Court at that point. So there is a whole process involved, and we're seeing that highlighted on the news, whether or not the president is exceeding his authority and whether he has the right to do the things that he's doing, Should a judge be stepping into the shoes of the president, telling the president what to do? I don't think our system allows for that. And listen, I don't know how judges are making these decisions because we do have a separation of powers. It's clear to me, I mean, at least from my years of experience, we have the judicial branch, we have the executive branch, and you have the legislative branch. And, I don't think it's the job of the judiciary to overstep the executive branch and tell, the president that, you're deporting these criminal illegals, stop the plane and turn around the plane. I don't think so. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And whether that's a valid order of a court and that the president is bound by that, well, I guess we'll see.
Well, and that's why I was kind of wondering, just from your perspective, if this is the new normal, or if this is just a trend of the last several years, that it's like, oh, this will come and go, and eventually things will swing back to wanting to see those high profile cases, or if this is just the way things are now.
It's a complicated subject for sure. It really is. And it has been going on for some time. It has been. And it's going to be a call to action for people to get involved and, put aside partisan politics. And that's, I don't know. I don't know where this came from. An FBI agent in senior status, a CIA agent in senior status, no political ambitions, no political predispositions, but unfortunately, we're not seeing that today. And whether or not there should be some form of retaliation for that person taking a stand against one particular political opponent versus the other, look, these are things that have to be addressed. We really have to get forward moving on as a country, because we can't have our system work like that. It's not going to work.
Well, and it really speaks to, your book title, the imagery and everything, like Lady Justice is supposed to be blind, right? And weighing purely fact, but we're seeing that not happen more and more. So it feels like we're going in the wrong direction somehow.
Yeah, I just we witnessed that, and there might some people might disagree with me on taking a position on this, but I looked at these prosecutions of Trump that I thought were quite frankly bogus. And if you just peel back the layers of the onion, it's pretty easy to smell the onion. All you have to do is, if Fannie Willis is bringing a prosecution in Georgia and she's hired her boyfriend to be the prosecutor, she's paying him $600,000. We should all be appalled by that. I don't care what political affiliations you have, whether you're a Democrat, Republican. As Americans, we should be appalled by that. How is that person who has no prosecutorial experience or background brought in to prosecute a case, and he's your boyfriend? That's clearly a case of really a broken system. That should not be allowed. I don't care if she's a Republican, Democrat, no matter what. And he's being paid almost 6 times the amount of the highest paid prosecutor in your office, and he has no prosecutorial experience. I don't know. And you look at that, then you look at the situation in New York where you're elevating misdemeanors to become crimes, and you have a judge that's sending a jury charge to jurors and saying, take one from column A, it doesn't matter what crime you convict them of, as long as you convict them, basically. It's just not, to me, that the system it needs to be, somebody needs to be saying from on high, this is not the way it works, and we're going to reform this. Whether it's the Supreme Court, if they have that authority to speak to these issues, but somebody needs to do that. And I think the president is certainly doing it. And unfortunately, it's coming across as very partisan when he says it, because, hey, he was the one that went through the system. But anybody should be able to say that pretty easily, that this is not the way it's supposed to work.
Well, and there's again, objective things that we can look at when we see like videos of police officers being, ganged up on and beaten, and we don't see a trial, versus we see, someone like take a stand in public to subdue somebody who's, wildly dangerous, and then they go to trial, which I think was
Daniel Penny.
Daniel Penny, yeah. It's like Daniel Penny did the thing that you're supposed to do as an American citizen, is protect your fellow citizens. And they were like, let's try him for capital murder.
That was a terrible prosecution, and it was motivated by politics and race. Quite frankly, race was a motivating factor in that case. because the victim was an African American. He was a Caucasian, and I agree. Like, this man was mentally deranged, and his family didn't step in. He had a number of convictions, had a number of run-ins with the law, and he was behaving in a bizarre, irrational manner, in a threatening manner, and he was a dangerous person and could have hurt or killed someone that day. And quite frankly, we as citizens want someone like Daniel Penny to step up like that. If your wife or your daughter or someone were on that subway train, you would say, thank God there was somebody like that there. And then he turns around and he gets the support and the assistance physically to subdue this person, and the man dies. And I don't think that that's the outcome anybody would ever want, ever. But then he gets tried for murder, and really, he had no purpose or intent to kill this man. That was not his intention whatsoever. It was really to, subdue this person. And they called for help. It wasn't like he did all the wrong things. He did everything that anybody would do.
Well,
And that was a rigged system too, because listen, the jury came back hung, right, on the first count. And the judge, instead of saying the case is dismissed, the jury's hung. You have to decide, you're going to try this case again, or it's going to just go. No, the judge sends it back to the jury with the one charge, like trying to ensure the conviction of this guy. Well, that's not how it's supposed to work, because that may be very well what the prosecution wanted. They were going to over-indict the guy, get the highest degree out there, and then if the jury got stuck on that, well, we'll give them a compromise. And maybe that's what they wanted all along, was the lesser charge. And then the judge sends it back to the jury with just a lesser charge. And thankfully, the jury saw through that, and they said, no, he's not guilty. He's not guilty, and they acquitted him. He didn't commit a murder. He did not have a purpose, intent, or recklessly commit a murder. What he was doing that day was trying to protect other people from this bizarre behavior that this person could have hurt or killed someone else.
yeah, it seems crazy. Like the judge is saying, like, come on, give me a consolation prize.
Right.
And you're like, what are you doing?
Right. Well, that's my point. It's a system that demonstrates that, and that judge should not. Someone should have admonished that judge for that. A senior judge or whatever should have called this judge in and said, you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed. There was no hue and cry, though. I didn't hear the public sentiment outrage over this. But me, as being part of the system, as an attorney, say that's not the way it's supposed to work. It doesn't work like that. And I've often said, it doesn't matter if it's Donald Duck or Donald Trump. It doesn't matter. It's the system has to work for everyone.
Well, and this has been amazing. I've loved our conversation. Is there any like myths or misconceptions or common topics that we haven't touched on that you usually share with people?
Well, I always say the idea of being innocent until proven guilty is it's an idea in the mind, not in the system. We all have that concept that oh well, I'm really innocent until I'm proven guilty. But the sad part about the matter is that you walk into that courtroom and you almost are guilty until you can show you're innocent. And I can't tell you how many times I had to get investigators involved in a case to dispel the idea that they're guilty and show quite the opposite. The burden comes over and shifts to the defense to show you're not guilty versus the state showing evidence that you are guilty. That is, I think, a myth in our system, and that unfortunately exists. And people don't really know that until, unfortunately, they're involved in the system. And hopefully you never get involved in the system. You never have to deal with that.
Yeah,
But
hopefully.
it does happen. Right.
Well, and that's the thing, is it's supposed to be like beyond a reasonable doubt. And so you're
Yeah.
like, okay, well, if there's any doubt in your mind, like they should have to address it. And yet, like you said, they just kind of go, all right, well, he's guilty until I can see for 100% certain, beyond a reasonable doubt, he's innocent.
Yeah, and cases can be based on either direct or circumstantial evidence, and a jury has to be able to evaluate circumstantial evidence just as much as they do direct evidence. Direct evidence seeing somebody commit the crime versus circumstantial evidence from all of the factors, a fingerprint analysis, a bloody knife, whatever it may be, DNA evidence. It may not be that you're going to have someone that's an eyewitness to the crime. And we've now learned that, eyewitness testimony can be disputed and it is not reliable all the time. So, and identifications are not reliable all the time when people pick people out of lineups and things like that. And there is that concern about, suggestion that perhaps somebody suggested, hey, let's take a look at the lineup, and you might want to be looking at everyone carefully, and if you haven't seen anyone, then you need to look again and keep looking until you focus on, and they might make a suggestion to someone. They're like, oh yeah, it's number 4. I got to pick number 4. I think that's what they're saying. Pick number 4. I think that's the number, So there is something called in New Jersey a Wade hearing where you can challenge whether or not there was some suggestibility in the lineup process. And so, that's the role of a good attorney, a good defense attorney, is to look at all the issues and determine where the problems lie and explore those things and bring them to the court, and then hope and pray that you're getting your points out and that's compelling enough to convince the court, because that could make the difference between, not guilty and guilty.
Well, and that's one of those, like an eyewitness, when you're like, well, this is the 3rd year of the case. We've been in, pre-trial, we've done all the other hearings, we've done all this stuff. Like, we're in year 3. I have to call this person as a witness who saw something 3 years ago. Like, how clear is your memory?
Yeah, exactly. And how many times are you going to tell the same story the same exact way? There's going to be differences in that story. So, a good defense attorney really needs to get a hold of the transcripts of the previous proceedings and the other times that they testified under oath and compare that. And there's going to be something distinct and different. Believe me, there definitely is. In fact, I talk about it in the book. One of my chapters, one of the second trials I did is called The Babysitters from Hell. And it involved an aunt, an uncle, and a cousin babysitting these young children and sexually abusing them over a period of time. Well, we offered a deal to the cousin who had a very low mental capacity, and we offered him a better outcome, a plea deal, a more favorable recommendation if he testified against the aunt and uncle, consistent with that of the children that were going to be testifying in the case. And we took a sworn statement from him under oath that he, in fact, observed them and he participated and did these things. And when it came time for him to testify, he said, no, I lied, in the statement to the investigator that was under oath. So now the jury had to make an evaluation of whether he was being truthful, that he lied when he gave the statement to the investigator in support of his favorable deal, or was his testimony on the stand that he never saw anything more truthful. So it was like a legal conundrum. It was really an evidential issue, but ultimately the jury concluded that the statement he gave to the investigator was more powerful and persuasive, and certainly it was compelling, and it was consistent with what the children that were the victims testified to. So he was convicted as well, and the deal was off the table, obviously.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, this book sounds incredible. I'm looking forward to reading it. Please tell people where they can find it and more from you if they're looking for more.
Sure. The book is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Not yet in brick and mortar. We're working on that. But you can find me and find the book, www.unequal-justice.com, or you can just Google me, www.Porfido Law or James Porfido, and you'll find me, or just Google James Porfido, and you'll certainly find me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions or inquiries that come my way.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. If anybody picks up this book, which I highly suggest you should, leave good reviews, right? Because that's how people find this book easier, and how it gets into more stores is by having good reviews for people.
Thank you. That is true. Yes, I didn't say that, but thank you for saying that.
Of course. No, I know how much it means to have these good reviews, so I do always encourage people, and all the links for this are in the show notes. So if you scroll up, you will see them. Super easy. Click, take it wherever you want it. James, thank you so much for being here. This has been an amazing interview, and I appreciate it immensely.
Thank you. It was truly a pleasure. There's so much to talk about. I think we just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more under the surface for sure, and I do appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, certainly. Hopefully we'll get you back one day.
I look forward to it. That'd be great.
I could have easily spent all day talking to James about those major trials of Casey Anthony, the Menendez brothers, O.J. Simpson, Michael Jackson, Harvey Weinstein, and Scott Peterson, but I kinda had to let him go, live a normal life, too. In other news, April is rolling on and the rankings are a little more regular now. Number 1, the United States, with Oregon, Washington, and California now at the front. West Coast. Number 2, England of the United Kingdom. Number 3, Australia, with Queensland and Victoria all tied up. Number 4, Canada, with Ontario still on top. And number 5, New Zealand, back after some time away. And it's nice to have you back. I always love seeing how this list swings and changes as the show grows. It's just one of those things that I do for me. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend, and I'll see you all back here next week for another new episode. Until that next episode, pretty pleased to all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Also remember, you can reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social media pages if you want to reach me personally. But most importantly, stay dumb.